Hi, good morning, everyone. It is 11 o'clock, so we're going to get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Olivia Baroni with SVP. We do have a large group, so we just ask that you keep your mics muted throughout the presentation. And if you have any questions or comments, just type them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them at the end. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded, and I will be sending out the slides from today's presentation this afternoon, so just look out for that in your inbox. Okay. SVP is a disaster recovery and resilience nonprofit working to shrink the time between disaster and recovery. As part of that goal, we've partnered with the Walmart Foundation to present webinars focused on educating disaster recovery leaders to fortify people against unnecessary suffering. SVP has 5 interventions: rebuilding efficiently, sharing our model with other organizations, preparing home and business owners through resilience training, advising municipal and state officials, and advocating for policy improvements to the disaster recovery industry. We believe in a holistic approach to disasters, increasing resilience before and streamlining recovery after. So now I'll pass it over to our Senior Government Advisor, J.R. Sanderson.
Hey, good morning, folks. We got some upcoming webinars for you that we think will be very interesting. We're going to do common pitfalls on September 7th. We'll ask that you join us for that one. HUD proofing is also out there on October 12th. And then in November and December, we're going to talk about how do we move our organizations forward and how are we leading those great public administrators that are working for us. Next chart, please. We do have some upcoming leader practitioner course training that we're going to be doing. We are doing a MIT-focused, what we're calling the mitigation practitioner course. We're doing that in New Orleans in September. We're also going to do a leader practitioner course in November. We are full right now for September. That class is filled up quickly, and we're going to have a great time down there. Looking forward to all the folks who are going to join us down there. We're going to talk about mitigation. The November course is about half full. So if you'd like to attend that, please let Olivia or I know, and we can work through some details. Of course, all this is paid for in terms of travel expenses, lodging, and instruction course materials. That's all paid for by a generous grant from the Walmart Foundation. Tentatively for next year, we are looking at doing a West Coast leader practitioner course. We're not certain yet what state we're going to do it in, but we feel like we need to go out west, and something we've been talking about for a while. In May of next year, we will run another mitigation course, and we'll run at least one more leader practitioner course next year. So if you're interested in any of these, please let us know, and we'll be glad to talk to you and coordinate visits. Next chart, please. So unfortunately, the Walmart Foundation does not pay for the Finance for Effect course. This is a charged course, something we have to charge for. We do have quite a bit of demand on this right now. Right now, we've got several jurisdictions, states that want to send their finance leaders to this. This is a 2-day course that we're going to attempt to hold somewhere in the February 2023 timeframe. We're looking right now hard at Savannah, Georgia, and holding the course there. This is 2 days. You get about 4 hours of CDBG-Dr overview, and then the rest of the time is devoted to nothing but finance, because we all know that when finance fails in a DR program, everything fails in a DR program. Again, unfortunately, this is a per seat cost, and so we do charge $2,200 per seat for this course. We think right now we'll have enough to fill. So if you're interested in this, please contact myself or Olivia. Next chart, please. A couple of things that we're doing in terms of advertising and advising, of course, is the leader practitioner course. We are holding the finance leader course. And I would also say to you that we do have quite a bit of our effort now is spent in assessments of grantees. So if you're interested in an assessment, let us know. We also offer, in addition to that, a planning outcomes workshop as well as a management outcomes workshop. And I think both of those have proven to be tremendously successful for a number of grantees in trying to reverse this idea that disaster recovery is failing in America. So if you're interested in any of these, please let us know. Next chart, please. And finally, we ask that you follow us on LinkedIn. We are trying to be as open about this as we can in our advertising and all the things we're trying to do. So please just tag in with us, and you can learn quite a bit just being a part of that. Next chart, please. So I'm going to introduce the great team that's going to talk to you today. Joe Boys was the former Disaster Recovery Division Director at South Carolina. I've known Joe forever, it seems like, and he has just been a phenomenal disaster recovery leader. Probably has one of the highest disaster IQs of anybody in the nation, and he will be leading the first part of this course today on federal cross-cutting requirements. Next slide, please. In addition to that, you get the great Michelle Stinnett, who formerly ran the Colorado program and is an absolute genius on 2 CFR 200 things associated with CDBG-Dr finance, as well as many of these other federal cross-cutting requirements. The only thing I'd add before we get started here today, folks, is sometimes we get so focused on federal cross-cutting requirements that we forget the big picture, that this is a program and the program's got to deliver. So with that, let me pass this over to the great Joe Boys, who will kick us off. So Joe, hit it off there, buddy.
Thank you, sir. And as JR mentioned, I'll editorialize for a moment here. While these federal cross-cutting requirements are extremely critical for preventing a situation where your organization may have to repay funds to HUD, you can do a lot of work up front to set up sound policies and process flows to ensure that you are complying with all of these federal cross-cutting requirements without hindering your progress. So staying outcome focused, but having strong process flows, a strong system of record that puts in stopgap measures to ensure that you're not violating any of these will help you go a long way with ensuring that you comply, but also not slowing down your recovery process. And at the end of the day, there are three key components of your organization that should be intimately familiar with federal cross-cutting requirements. That's whoever's responsible for your policy, who's responsible for your compliance, and then your legal department. They're your last line of defense in ensuring that you do not violate any of these. So today we're going to cover environmental review. We're going to talk about fair housing and civil rights. We're going to talk about the Uniform Relocation Act, Davis-Bacon, as well as other related labor standards in Section 3. With that, we'll move on to environmental review. Next slide, please. Next slide. So as you can see, there are a number of related laws that are a part of the environmental review process, 17 in total. And we're not going to talk about all these today, but I will draw your attention to a critical tool that is available for free to you through the EPA. It's a website called NEPASYST. That's NEPASSIST, NEPASYST.gov has a tool where you can enter a specific property address, and it will pull up many of these components for you, helping you to streamline your environmental review process and also cross-check your contractor if they're doing it for you to ensure that they are complying and everything is up to standard. Next slide, please. So here are many of the federal sources for where the environmental regulations are located. And as Olivia mentioned, we'll have these slides sent out to you after the presentation, so I'm not going to read these to you. You can refer back to it at your leisure. Next slide, please. So we're going to dive right into what an environmental review is. It's basically an analysis of the impacts of a project on the surrounding environment. It's designed to ensure public participation and make sure that whatever you intend to do using federal funds is not going to have a detrimental impact to the environment. And it really is going to help you to prevent lawsuits, project delays, funding denials, and negative perception if you have a strong environmental review that supports the project you intend to undertake. Next slide, please. So here are some keys to success when conducting your environmental review. You want to coordinate early with any state or local environmental agencies who are going to need to be a part of your process. HUD Exchange has a number of resources that will help you with making sure that you're in compliance when it comes to the environmental review. You really want to use Secretary of Interior qualified people to complete your Section 106 review, and we'll talk about what that is a little bit later. If you have an opportunity, you want to adopt a FEMA programmatic agreement, which we'll also talk about. And you need to have an online system for developing, documenting, and managing all levels of it. And you need to make sure that all of your case files in your online system have the complete environmental record in them so that you do not have to repay funds in the event that you get audited by the OIG or through a HUD monitoring visit. Next slide, please. So it's basically just a written record of your environmental decision-making process. It needs to be written in a way that it is user-friendly. You have to have public notice. You have to have public comment available. It needs to tell the story of what you intend to do. having the project description. You need to have a lot of maps and photos, documentation of all the consultation that you've done with whatever required state or federal agencies that are a part of the process. And you have to make sure that you document that appropriate public notice. There are basically 3 different types of environmental reviews. So there's an environmental assessment, and that's where you know specifically what site you want to work, and it is a simple enough process that you do not have to complete an environmental impact statement. The second type is an environmental impact statement. That's where the project that you intend to undertake is going to have a dramatic impact on a number of the elements associated with the environmental review. So you have to do a much more comprehensive study of the impacts of your proposed project, as well as identifying alternatives that may be viable to that. And the third is what's called a tiered environmental review process, where you may know that you intend to undertake a specific activity in a specific area, such as a county, but you don't know exactly where the sites are going to be. So you can identify many of the elements at the broad level and then do a site-specific review. So we're going to talk about those last 2 types in further detail now. Next slide, please. So tiering environmental assessments. This is where you can, so the best example of tiering environmental assessments is if you have a single family housing rehab program. So you may know, 7 of the 17 elements for every single property that you might possibly contemplate completing within a county. So you identify all those elements in what's known as the Tier 1 broad review, and then you look to identify the other elements in a Tier 2 site-specific review. So your public notice requirement for this is only at the broad review level. You do not have to do public notice for every single individual site in which you intend to work on through the tiered environmental assessment process. And then you also complete your request for release of funds at the broad level, but you cannot commit any funds to an individual site until you've completed that site-specific review. If you do, that's what's known as a choice limiting action, and then you are subject to repaying all of those funds in the event that that happens. So a choice limiting decision can be as simple as having a contract with a homeowner to move forward on the project. You cannot contractually obligate any funding prior to having both the Tier 1 and the Tier 2 complete. Next slide, please. So your Tier 1 broad review is going to establish your written strategy for what you intend to do for your site-specific review, as well as defining all the contemplating activities, all proposed funding sources, the maximum number of units, the average cost per unit, the geographic range, and the expiration date. Now, I'll note that for the maximum number of units and the average cost per unit, you may not know that at the outset. So this is kind of your best guesstimate. HUD's not going to hold you to that number. It's not like you need to go back and modify it if it turns out you did 100 projects instead of 90, or they cost you $80,000 instead of $50,000 per unit. This is just your best guess at the beginning of the process. But you want to try to identify all of the related environmental laws that you can at the broad level, because it's going to help to streamline your Tier 2 process, which we'll now talk about on the next slide. So any laws that you are not able to resolve at the broad review have to be resolved at the site-specific review. And you want to do this as you identify individual sites. So once you've gone out and done your environmental or your damage assessment, you'll then know you'll have the photographs necessary to complete your Tier 2 site-specific review. And you want to make sure that you're following all the protocols that you said you were going to follow at the broad level to address all of those remaining environmental review questions. And once again, you do not want to have a future limiting action. So do not move forward with any contractual or construction action on a site until you've completed that Tier 2 site-specific review. Next slide, please. So when you use a tiered system, your completed environmental review record must be your Tier 1 broad level review and your Tier 2 site-specific review. And that has to be documented in your system of record for each individual case, along with your request for release of funds and your public notices. So you really want to avoid monitoring findings. So if your system of record is not set up for you to be able to store all of those environmental documents in the single case file, you really need to consider modifying your system of record to have all of that available. Otherwise, you're going to be in a situation where you have HUD or the OIG coming in to look at paper files, and inevitably something will get lost in the process. And while you may have done it the right way, if it's not properly documented, it doesn't count. Next slide, please. So the last that we'll talk about is that environmental impact statement. This is where you have a situation where there's going to be some drastic impact on the environment, or there are several different factors associated with it that, while they may be minor impacts, combined, they create a situation where you have a major impact. So there's basically a process for conducting an environmental impact statement. And I would encourage you, if you have a project where you need to complete an environmental impact statement, hire a contractor to do that for you so that you can pass along the risk and you're not on the hook if one of these steps goes wrong. You can contractually obligate your way out of the risk associated with the environmental impact statement as long as you write a strong contract. Next slide, please. So now we'll talk a little bit about historic preservation. Next slide. So Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act defines what you have to do to ensure that your activity is not going to have a detrimental impact on some historical structure within the area in which you're working. And the way that you're going to navigate this is through your state historical preservation office. So if you do not yet have a strong relationship with your SHPO, I would encourage you to reach out, because that's going to save you a ton of time, because they are going to have to review your projects that are historically significant, and you do not want them taking forever and a day to get that done. So you can create a programmatic agreement, which allows you to exempt a number of the properties that you contemplate working on from having to go through that SHPO process. And on the next slide, we'll talk a little more detail about what a programmatic agreement is. So typically FEMA will have a prototype programmatic agreement that you as an agency can adopt. So your state already likely has an agreement in place. You as the agency can adopt it, and it allows you to save significant time, and you don't have to send all of your projects to SHPO. So you can move a lot quicker when it comes to rehab and reconstruction of properties within your disaster impacted area. Next slide, please. So floodplain management and wetlands. Next slide. Basically, with both floodplain management and wetlands management, the purpose of this is to avoid the possible long and short-term adverse impacts associated with doing work in the floodplains. And it's really critical because, as many of us have experienced, flooding is the most common disaster. So you can find the regulations, 24 CFR Part 55, that basically lay out what you need to do to comply with floodplain management. The key is, if you intend to complete a rehab in the floodplain where the rehab is greater than 50% of the value, there are requirements associated with that we'll talk about in a minute. Any building of new construction or reconstruction, any roads or pipelines. Really, the only thing that you can do that's not subject to the floodplain management rules are minor clearing and grubbing. And when we talk about the elevation requirements or critical actions, you're really talking about hospitals, police, fire stations, nursing homes, other critical facilities such as that. Next slide, please. So here's what you can't do. You cannot build in the floodway. So if you have a home, and when we say build, you cannot repair a home in the floodway. So if you have a disaster impacted resident who lives in the floodway, really your only option is going to be an acquisition or buyout. You need to get them out of the floodway. You cannot do work within the floodway. You cannot do any new construction of a non-critical action in a coastal high hazard area. And you're going to be using the FEMA flood insurance rate maps, which are almost always backwards looking. So there often will be preliminary firm maps available. So whenever you're completing your floodplain management review, you really want to use the best data available. So while the old map might say this property wasn't in the floodplain, I would encourage you to defer to the new map. And if it is in the floodplain, make sure that you comply with floodplain management. And keep in mind that, floodwaters don't really care a whole lot about what the flood map says. So at the end of the day, if your goal is to make your community more resilient and prevent future disaster damage, you want to look at your best available data source to ensure that you are meeting the intent of the environmental regulations associated with floodplain management. Next slide, please. So when elevating, if you have new construction or substantial improvement, and once again, substantial improvement is 50% or more of the value, the fair market value of the property, and that includes any work that the homeowner may have done before you got there, including any volunteer work that may have occurred, such as mucking and gutting by a nonprofit. In the event that you have that situation, you must elevate the structure at least 2 feet above the base flood elevation for the 100-year floodplain. And while 2 feet above the base flood elevation has always been the standard. We'll talk a little bit more about flood insurance in a minute, but you can have significant savings for your applicants if you go higher than 2 feet above base flood elevation. So FEMA came out with a new risk rating 2.0 for the National Flood Insurance Program, and rates have increased significantly for premiums, even for structures that are 2 feet above the base flood elevation. So if you go 4 feet above BFE, you can have significant savings for your low to moderate income applicants who participate in your program. Now, those critical facilities, which are hospitals, nursing homes, police, and fire stations, have to be at least 3 feet above the base flood elevation. And you want to make sure that if you have communities in your jurisdictions that have more stringent codes, to follow those codes to ensure that you're creating more resilience. And the only thing that's exempt from the elevation requirements are structures that are listed on the National Register of Historic Places or a state inventory of historic places. That doesn't mean that you cannot elevate them. It just means that you're not required to. And how do you confirm that you're actually above 2 feet above the base flood elevation? One of the tools that we used in South Carolina was we just did multiple surveys. So we did the initial survey that determined what BFE plus 2 needed to look like. Once we had the foundation built, we required another survey to ensure that before we go ahead and build the house on that foundation, we're actually at the right spot. And then we shot the final elevation once construction was complete, where we documented that it was in fact a structure where it was the lowest floor was base flood elevation plus 2 feet. Next slide, please. So wetlands goes along with the floodplain management, and basically, once again, just to prevent long and short-term adverse impacts associated with the destruction or modification of wetlands. So you want to look at non-structural alternatives to floodplain development and the prevention of the destruction of wetlands. Because if you go messing around in the wetlands, it's a very easy way to get yourself in trouble with HUD and the EPA. Next slide, please. So there's an 8-step process that you can follow for both floodplain management and wetlands management. If you intend to do single family rehab or replacement only, you only have to do this at the broad review level. For any multifamily or infrastructure, you have to follow the 8-step process for the individual projects. And you can complain your floodplain notices with your wetlands notices, but unless it is an aggregated review. And next slide, please. So here's what that 8-step process looks like. So you want to figure out where your action is located in the floodplain. You want to have early public and agency review. You have to identify and evaluate any alternatives located in the 100-year floodplain. And this is where it can get incredibly tricky, because while there may be many alternatives available, the alternatives, while they appear viable on paper, there is always a human element involved. So a lot of folks are not going to want to move away from where they are. So while there may be a viable alternative, you can still move forward as long as you document properly. You have to identify your potential impacts. You need to try to minimize harm and restore and preserve the natural and beneficial values. The next step is you need to reevaluate your alternatives. You have your findings posted, and then you once again seek public input, and then you can move forward once you've completed those 8 steps. Next slide, please. So with flood insurance is required for a building that's located in the special flood hazard area in the event that they have received federal aid at any point. So if your applicant has received FEMA dollars, or you're going to serve them using CDBG-Dr dollars, once that work is completed, they are required to obtain and maintain flood insurance. And by statute, there are 2 different coverage periods for how long they have to have flood insurance, depending on the type of funding that they receive. So if your applicant only receives loans, then they only have to keep the coverage for the life of the loan. In the event that they receive a grant, they have to keep coverage for forever, in perpetuity. And that includes even if they sell the house. So the flood insurance requirements follow the property address, not the actual applicant. So it's critical that you have processes in place for notification requirements in the event that your applicants intend to sell the property at some point down the road, because if they are impacted once again by a disaster, you will not be able to help them even if they never received a penny from the federal government, because that requirement is tied to the property address, not the applicant. And I would encourage you, when talking about flood insurance, to not only focus on your applicants that are located in the special flood hazard area, because as I mentioned earlier, the floodwaters do not care one bit about what the flood map says. So many of our flood applicants were actually outside of what the FEMA flood maps said. You also have an option through public services to actually provide flood insurance funding for your applicants for a period that you determine, keeping in mind, of course, that you cannot spend more than 15% of your allocation on public services. But this may be a tool, particularly with the increased cost of premiums, as well as the low to moderate income applicants that many of the programs end up serving, for you to be able to fill that gap and ensure that they have flood insurance at least for, a reasonable period to cover the federal investment. Next slide, please. Here are the limits for NFIP coverage. It's $250,000 for single family residential structures, as well as an additional $100,000 for building contents, $500,000 for multifamily or non-residential with $500,000 for contents. And then there's $100,000 for renters contents only coverage. And once again, all structures should likely get flood insurance because the floodwaters do not care what the maps say. Next slide, please. With that, I will now turn it over to Michelle.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, so the final part that we're going to talk about for the environmental review is the Endangered Species Act. The most important thing to remember is that early coordination here is essential. You need to know what endangered species are in your area. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service both have 90 days to perform a consultation, which can obviously seriously delay your projects. One project that I worked on in Colorado had to determine the impact on the Preeble's jumping mouse. It's that cute little mouse that's in the southwest corner on that map. He's adorable, but he hasn't actually been seen in Colorado in several decades. Colorado is the ideal habitat for the mouse, though, so we had to go through our ESA 7 consultation. U.S. Fish and Wildlife issued a biological opinion, but when we got the biological opinion, the success criteria within the biological opinion actually contradicted the rest of the biological opinion, so we had to have Fish and Wildlife complete another consultation. They most definitely take their 90-day timeline seriously, and they used a full 90 days to respond to every single email that we sent them. Just to say, early coordination is your biggest thing here. Some examples of activities that impact species are provided here. Tons of activities, not just these, can trigger the ESA. So make sure that you know what activities that you're doing, and whether or not they can potentially impact species, so you can get ahead of this. Next slide, please. Moving on to fair housing and civil rights laws, there's obviously a ton of laws. The Fair Housing Act is the one that prohibits discrimination in housing related transactions. This is also the act that requires all federal programs related to housing and urban development be administered in a manner that affirmatively furthers fair housing. So those policies that you already have, that's where this comes from. But then there's obviously a ton of other ones. Title VI prohibits discrimination for anything that's receiving federal assistance. All sorts of laws here. Next slide, please. Additionally, then we have the executive orders. Most of these mainly further clarify or implement existing fair housing laws. Next slide, please. So from these laws, we get the requirement to make our programs accessible to those with limited English proficiency. All HUD-funded programs, not just CDBG-Dr and MIT, must comply with the Title VI and Executive Order 13166 requirements. Next slide, please. To do this, we have to complete a 4-factor analysis and develop our language access plans. 4-factor analysis includes us taking a look at the number or proportion of LEP persons in the community, the frequency that those people will come into contact with our programs, the importance of services or information that we are putting out, and then the cost of us providing resources compared to what resources or what financial resources that we have. For instance, our action plan and program policies are more important for those with limited English proficiency, and we should be translating those to our most prevalent languages. We should also obviously always engage in our targeted research. Next slide, please. These are the components of a language access plan. It's all pretty common sense, but the biggest thing here is to make sure that you're training your staff. And then if you go to number 10, make sure that you're monitoring and updating your plan frequently. Next slide, please. Some of the best practices include updating your language access plan in response to the disaster. You're specifically looking for the impacts on those LEP persons after the disaster. You should do this early in the process. Make sure that you're getting your public participation. And then obviously you're going to want to translate your action plan into the appropriate languages that make the most sense for your community. And not just your action plan. You're going to want to translate all vital documents, make them available on your website. So your action plan, your program benefits and restrictions, your application process, and especially your complaint process and your appeal rights. And then also you need to publicize your language rights for disaster recovery on pretty much everything that you're doing. Next slide, please. These are just some suggestions for written translation. These are also available on the HUD FHEO website, and Olivia is going to send out this slideshow after the webinar. Next slide, please. Reasonable accommodations are something that we also must be doing. If someone has a disability, whether that's seen or unseen, we have to make exceptions as necessary to our maximums outlined in our action plan to comply with these accessibility standards. There must be a documented relationship between the requested accommodation and the individual's disability, but all of the documentation that you collect must be kept confidential. Next slide, please. So you might need additional documentation if the disability is either known and the accommodation isn't readily apparent, or if the disability itself isn't obvious. You, as the grantee, can only request information that is absolutely essential to evaluate those disability-related needs. You have to make accommodations unless they would present an undue financial burden, but even then, you're still required to make other accommodations up to the point that it wouldn't result in an undue burden. Next slide, please. Preferences has become a hot topic with FHEO lately, but you definitely should be implementing preferences in your housing programs. As you all know, grantees have a very limited amount of funding. Only prioritizing low to moderate income people will still leave you with more people to serve than you have money for. To better prioritize those limited funds, it makes sense to serve those who are least likely to be able to recover themselves, like families with children under 5, the elderly, those that are disabled. You do have to make sure that you have a legitimate health and safety concern to base that preference on. For example, the one here is that families with children under the age of 5, there are more likely consequences for young children if there is prolonged exposure to mold. So we want to help those families first before we move on to other people within our programs. Next slide, please. The Uniform Relocation Act, this is a fun one. A lot of people get kind of bogged down in the details of URA. There are 2 key subparts that leaders generally need to be aware of. Subpart B, which deals with real property acquisition, and subpart C, which are those general relocation requirements. It is important to remember that the definitions in the URA in statute for displaced persons exempt owners unless they're displaced due to involuntary acquisition. So if you are not using eminent domain and you are not forcing people out of their homes, then URA is only going to apply to tenants. Make sure that you're asking up front before you're providing assistance whether or not someone has a tenant. That way you can save yourself time and heartache later. Another note is, although it deals with real property acquisition, those displaced from, or tenants that are displaced from mobile homes, regardless of whether or not your state classifies mobile homes as real property or personal property, they are still eligible for URA benefits, regardless one way or the other. Next slide, please. Big thing with URA is you need to know what is and what isn't a URA trigger. In addition to knowing who's considered displaced and who isn't, URA does not apply to displacements not caused by a federally assisted project. There's obviously some examples there. Additionally, the actual statute specifically calls out some forms of assistance like tax credits, mortgage insurance that are not considered federal assistance specifically for URA purposes. Next slide, please. Some things to remember. The biggest thing is to remember to follow your own policies and procedures. You wrote it down, you told HUD you were going to do it, you need to follow your own policies. You have to understand the steps that you have to take and how to document what you did. Just like all other CDBG-Dr and MIT funding, we can't duplicate benefits with URA payments. That's a big one. There are tons of resources out there to help with URA. So URA the HUD way is a training that HUD puts on, but contacting your HUD relocation specialist for help is probably one of your biggest resources that's out there. Next slide, please. Davis-Bacon and related acts are onerous. It's difficult to demonstrate compliance. My best advice is to avoid triggering Davis-Bacon when you can. Single-family housing is exempt, but there are plenty of other ways to avoid it for other projects. For instance, if you're providing gap funding for low-income housing tax credit multifamily projects, you can and should structure your deal so that CDBG-Dr is only paying for those soft costs such as TAP and impact fees. That way you're not triggering Davis-Bacon. Now, if you can't avoid it, you need to make sure you're complying with your weekly reporting requirements. Next slide, please. These are your basic steps to success with Davis-Bacon. You need to make sure that all your requirements are included in your procurements. Verify that your contractor is eligible and can comply with these requirements. Your contractor will need to report weekly on wage compliance, but you also need to monitor closely, including doing site interviews. Since COVID, grantees have needed to get creative for site interviews, but if you're unsure if you're complying with this, HUD's Davis-Bacon and Labor Standards Office is usually your best bet for getting guidance on that. Next slide, please. And then finally, Section 3 is what I like to call the participation trophy of all of our federal cross-cutting requirements. We have to provide opportunities in our programs to Section 3 residents and Section 3 business concerns. The threshold for DR projects or for DR programs was recently changed to contracts in excess of 200,000 instead of 100,000, but HUD is very often aggregating projects. So if you're working on 5 different sites and that adds up to more than $200,000, you're most likely still going to be subject to Section 3. The main idea here is that we're going to hire local and hire LMI when possible. But the big thing here is you are going to have to report on this annually to HUD. So build those reporting requirements into your policies and your contracts so you're not scrambling when it comes to reporting time. Next slide, please. So here are your definitions for Section 3 resident and Section 3 business concern. And like I said earlier, we're having to report annually. You need to make sure that you know how to use SPEARS, the performance evaluation and registry system. And the Section 3 minimum goals are here, but remember, we have to show that we tried to hit these goals, not necessarily that we hit these goals. As with all of the rest of the federal cross-cutting requirements that Joe and I talked about today, grantees have to be concerned with the outcomes of their programs. And so you should try not to get too bogged down in the weeds on these federal cross-cutting requirements. Your policy person, your compliance people, and your lawyer are going to be the ones that have to be in-depth, know all of the details of every single one of these. DR leaders need to know that they exist and need to know that you're complying with them. and where to find that documentation. But we need to be making sure that we are putting people back into safe, secure, and sanitary housing, not necessarily that we don't need to get off track looking at all of these individually. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. And if you guys have any questions, Joe and I are available.
Really, really well done, folks. Proud of this team. Y'all did a great job with this. Any questions? If you have any questions, just go ahead and type them in the chat box. Otherwise, we'll move on out of here. We thank you for your time and attention today, and we appreciate it. Let's go to the next chart, please, Olivia. So again, the upcoming webinars, we have found that we've got a lot of folks out there who are tuning into these webinars. We're thankful for you for doing that. We think this helps the entire disaster recovery industry. Well, thank you, Sarah. We're appreciative of the kind comment. And if you're interested in attending more of these, please just go to the SBP Advise webpage. We're looking next year to host at least 15 of these, and we're going to add in at least one completely dedicated to environmental requirements. Let's go to the next chart, please. So again, with our upcoming training that we're executing here in the near future, we are full for the MIT Focus course in September, but we do have openings for the November 8 to 10. That will be at the Hilton Riverside Hotel in New Orleans, Louisiana. And of course, next year, again, we're still trying to work through some details on a West Coast leader practitioner course, and that will be 3 days. Next chart. As we go here, we will talk a little bit about this Finance for Effect course that I talked about earlier. This is not paid for by the Walmart grant. Grantees have asked us to put this on. And so we all know how critical finance is in a CDBG-Dr operation, especially when you're dealing with 400 million, 600 million, $1 billion, $2 billion. I mean, the numbers just continue to go higher and higher. So if you're interested in this, we're probably going to do this either in Orlando or Savannah. Right now, we're targeting Savannah in February 2023. This is a demand-supported course, which means that if we don't have enough students, we don't run it because candidly, we don't make enough money to even pay for our own travel to get down there to do it. So with that, if you're interested in this or you have finance people that you work with that are DR finance folks, come see us on this. This is a great course. We ran it last year and had rave reviews from it. So thankful for that. Next chart, please. Again, back to our advised offerings. If you need us, give us a call. We are certainly available to help grantees. I think most of you know that we do not allow a lot of contractors in this. We try to be the advocate for the grantee, but these are the things that we do on a normal day-to-day basis. Let's go to the next chart, please. And finally, we'd ask us that you join us on LinkedIn, right? So if you have the opportunity, please tap in with SBP. We're a great and growing company, and our mission, of course, is to reduce the time between disaster and recovery. And all the folks on here today, specifically, great work by Joe and Michelle in talking through federal cross-cutting requirements. So I'm proud of both of you. Well done. And I will hand it back to you, Olivia. If you can find any questions, we'll answer them. Otherwise, we'll close out.
Thank you, JR. It seems like all the questions in the chat box were answered. But if anyone has any other questions, feel free. And with that, we look forward to seeing you on future webinars or in person at one of our leader practitioner course or our other events that we're planning for next year. I will be emailing out the slide deck from today, so just look out for that in your inbox within the next couple of hours. And thank you again on behalf of SVP and the Walmart Foundation. Have a great rest of your day. Oh, and I'm including the link. Sorry, all the links will be in the slides that I'm sending out. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.